Right now, sitting here talking to you, there is no major breaking story happening, but in 10 minutes' time, that might be different. So you have to have some grip on your priorities. I run in an athletics club and I really prioritise that time. That doesn't mean that I every single week make it, but it does mean that I start the week intending to make it.
Hello and welcome to Run the Business, the podcast that explores the place where running and leadership come together. We'll find out how running can help us with leading, connecting with people, and generally being better in business. We might even answer the question, do runners make better leaders? I'm Anthony Gay, and today's guest is the Director of Journalism and Deputy CEO of BBC News and Current Affairs. He's head of BBC Newsgathering, the world's largest broadcast news gathering operation with more than 60 international bureaux. He was previously at ITN for 26 years. He's covered the Balkans War, both Gulf Wars, and the Beijing and London Olympics. He's worked in the US, Russia, Africa, and was European correspondent for 3 years and political news editor for 2. Relevant to this conversation, though, he's also a runner. Jonathon Munro, welcome to Run the Business.
Thanks very much, Ant. It's great to be here.
Jonathon, how are you today?
I'm good. I haven't been running for a couple of days, so I'm itching to get out there, but I'm fine, thank you.
Great. And I'll address the elephant in the room straight away. It makes me a little nervous to be the one asking the questions to such a senior and experienced journalist as you are. Do you have any advice for me at the beginning of this conversation?
I always think simple advice is the best. Lots of open questions that could take the conversation anywhere you want to go. But I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, let's do that then. And let's start with just setting the context. Whereabouts are you in the world?
So I'm at home this morning. I'm in Northamptonshire. I'm very lucky to live in a part of the world that's pretty and lots of good running routes around here. And I've lived here for about 23 or 24 years. So I've run every back street and lane in this area in several pairs of rather dusty old trainers.
And tell us as well a little bit about what you do at the BBC, because it sounds, that intro, and I don't think it underplays it, you have a big role at the BBC.
Yes, so the formal job title is Director of Journalism at the BBC. So in that role, I oversee the journalistic activities of news and current affairs. And some of that is stuff that most of your listeners will recognise as BBC News. It does what it says on the tin. It's a BBC News programme, BBC News website or whatever. But there's a lot of work as well in current affairs and investigative reporting on programmes like Panorama or File on 4 on Radio 4, that sort of thing. Quite a lot of that derives now in podcasts, Newscast, Ukrainecast, those sorts of products. And with that goes the responsibility of a huge number of people. We've got a lot of staff at home and abroad, and we're a very big organisation with quite a high profile about which people have got their views. And we're publicly funded, so people are entitled to their views, absolutely entitled to their views. And that can be both a good thing and sometimes quite a frustrating thing when we're being knocked around a bit for people's gain. When they're making an argument, they choose to make it about the BBC. But it all goes with the sort of rough and tumble of a job in the biggest news organisation of the world. And every day is different, which is a nice thing to be able to say about anyone's job.
In an attempt to find some common ground, I noticed you're also a Yorkshireman. So
I am.
As I am as well. So can you tell me a little bit about sort of growing up in Yorkshire and if there was any running in that part of your life and sort of moving on to when did running become a thing for you?
Yeah, it wasn't when I was a kid, actually. I grew up in Yorkshire, grew up in what were, in those days, the sort of coalfields of South Yorkshire. They're not coalfields anymore. And I wasn't really into sport in a particularly big way at school. I think I had a very happy and good childhood and a very happy time at school. But the one thing that I think school didn't bring out of me was a love of running and sports that I could do. I was never very good at coordinating my body with a ball or a racket or a net, and I was never very interested in rugby or football or tennis. I couldn't really get the ball over the net very well. I used to swim quite a lot. Luckily we had a swimming pool that the school had use of, so I did that quite a bit. And I suppose that was a clue to more sort of solitary sport, which came into my life a bit later, and not really until my mid-30s, and I do regret not finding it earlier. I remember one day at school, I didn't really enjoy PE, but one day we did a cross-country run, and I really enjoyed it. And I can't explain why I didn't think to myself at the time, oh, I should do a bit more of this, because I actually had a bit of fun there in a way that I don't do when I'm going to play rugby. But I didn't. I can't explain why, but I didn't really discover it until much later.
And when you did discover it, where was that, and how did it come about?
Well, there's a direct connection to work, and I guess that's really the connections are really the theme of this conversation. But it's a sad connection, and one that makes me emotional even now. And it's 20 years ago, in fact, this month, when the world was watching the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, and I was at ITN at the time as head of Newsgathering, responsible for the deployments into Kuwait. And very sadly, very tragically, one of our teams in the desert came under fire from American Marines, and we lost a correspondent, a guy called Terry Lloyd, and two of his colleagues, and there was only one survivor, and it was a traumatic and incredibly difficult period. And through that period of managing the war and then going out to Kuwait to help manage the aftermath of that disaster, I just didn't eat really, and I lost quite a lot of weight, and I had a bit of weight to lose. So when I got back and went on a sort of much needed holiday after the trauma of covering that and the disaster of the loss, I thought, well, I don't want to put that weight back on again, but equally I don't want to sort of be on a constant, diet. So I'd better do something about it. So we were on holiday in South Africa with some friends in Johannesburg who lived out there. And at the shopping mall on the first day of the holiday, I thought, you know what, I'll just buy myself some running shoes. I hadn't really come equipped to do anything, but I thought if I just do a quick run every day, I'll just see what happens. I bought completely the wrong shoes. They were actually tennis shoes. I had no idea what I was buying, but they came from a sports shop. They kind of therefore sort of did the job. And I ran, and I found it incredibly difficult. It was like I could go a mile and I felt totally and absolutely exhausted. But what I hadn't realised, because I knew nothing about running, was that Johannesburg is very high in terms of its altitude. So I was running with, very thin oxygen. So I brought those same tennis shoes back home, back to sea level, and I put them on. I thought, well, I'll give it a go at home. And I could run for ages because I was like drinking in this really thick oxygen. And down the road from us, there's a reservoir with a towpath around it, a causeway around it, which is 7 miles. And I thought, well, I'll never be able to run this, having only run a mile in Johannesburg. And I got round first time. And I thought, okay, I've discovered something which I can do. I enjoy it. And you know what? I'm not going to be Sebastian Coe anytime soon, but I can do a respectable run. And that was great.
And at what point did you start to sort of feel the benefits of running? And you talked about the experience that you went through and wanting to sort of get out and run. There are huge mental health benefits from running, aren't there? And at what point did you start to appreciate that?
Yeah, massive mental health benefits, I think. I think in those very first few months, this is back in 2003, my focus was getting around that reservoir and then going a bit further and going a bit further. It was sort of task focused, really. It was when I relaxed into it, probably later that year, the year after that, I began to find myself as I was running around the reservoir or going further afield, beginning to think about things in my life, usually work life, although I had young kids at the time. So that was also, to be honest, it was quite nice to have a bit of time out and for myself, and began to realise, okay, I've just solved that problem by thinking that through on this run, or I've just realised how I should address this particular thorny issue at work next week. And then you build that sort of into your processes for coping with a busy job. It was I was still at ITN then. It was a big job. It wasn't as big as the job I'm in now, but it was a big job, and I found that enormously helpful. And I never really stopped running after that. I just kept on going, and the following year I did my first London Marathon, and that became a task thing. But then when you're in mile 15 or something, feeling extremely tired, and you begin to think about other things to take your mind off things, and that can get you into really interesting times in your brain where you're solving a problem, or thinking through a dilemma or whatever, and you feel a bit better for having done that.
Can you remember any specific problems or challenges that you worked through that even today you look back and go, "Oh, I remember when I solved that or did that or thought about that."
Oh yeah, lots. I mean, over the years, we've for example done lots of restructuring, and taken lots of money out, and made some really difficult decisions at the BBC about savings programs and that sort of thing. And as a senior leader, your job is to be the communicator of all that, as well as the one of the decision makers, and that's a pretty tough thing. Can be a tough thing. Um, and there've been lots of times when I've just refined my language, or my words, or my approach, or my attitude to a meeting or a consultation while I've been pounding the streets. And you'd never get all those things right, and people will always think, the handling of things isn't perfect, but it just gives you a chance to try to think things through in a way that is your own time. Because a key thing about my running is I never take my phone with me, because my phone goes off all the time for work, and it's the one time in my week when I know I'm not going to get interrupted by a call, a text, a WhatsApp, or anything. I leave my phone at home, and that gives you the time to think things through and to change your mind about things. That happens a lot. You start the run thinking, I'll tell you what, I'll attack this in a certain way, and by the time you've finished, you thought, no, that's not going to work. I'll do it a different way, and I think everybody needs that space and time, and for me, it's definitely when I'm out running.
Were you running when you were traveling? When you were covering events around the world and you were a correspondent, or was that a different part of your life?
It was a different part of my life, because by the time the Gulf War happened, I was in management, ITN. So I travel for different reasons now. But one of the beauties of being a runner, I think, is that even if I'm going hand luggage only, I can either wear or take my running shoes with me pretty much everywhere. And you just need those, a pair of shorts and a vest, and you've got everything you need. So you don't, friends I go travelling with sometimes, they're trying to book a tennis court, or find a golf course, or find someone to play some sport with or other. You don't need any of that, do you? You just need your basic running kit, a reasonable idea of a route, which you could just bring up on a Google map, and that can be 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours or longer. And most decent hotels have a reasonable gym, so I do quite a lot of treadmill stuff. So I always travel with my running kit. I think it's really important.
When you look back on your running and think about how you've developed as a leader, can you see the benefits that running has brought to your style and who you are as a leader?
Yeah, I think I can. Whether they're evident to anyone else, of course, probably not. But I think part of it is keeping things in perspective, and life can teach you all kinds of lessons about that, can't it? I remember on my first marathon, I was, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm never going to win the London Marathon. I'm a sort of around about a 4 hour marathoner, that sort of distance at a time. I've done 10 Londons, and I've done exactly half of them under 4 hours, and exactly half of them just over 4 hours. I remember on the first one, I was aiming for 4 hours. I think lots of people do that in their first marathon. They try. In my view, it's a mistake, actually. I think the first marathon is all about getting round, but I didn't know that at the time. So I was trying to get, and I was there in 4 hours, 2 minutes. So it was sort of really frustrating, but then again, a real reason for going again. But I remember, for those of you on the London Marathon will know that at the very end, you go down Birdcage Walk, and then you turn right past what's known as the Wedding Cake, which is the memorial to Victoria, just outside Buckingham Palace. And then you turn up towards the finish line, and you can see the finish line just in front of you. And as I turned that last corner, thinking I'm not going to get 4 hours, it was already 3:58 or 3:59 even by then. And I was feeling pretty down about it. And then I had to laugh because I was overtaken by a man dressed as a pepperami. And, he's in this massive hot thing, and he's run 26.2 miles. And he's looking, I can't see his face because he's covered in artificial sausage meat. But you just have to laugh at that point and think, you know what, all human life is here, and people are doing amazing things, and they're doing them better than me or worse than me or faster than me or slower than me. It doesn't matter. They're all doing it in their own way. And I think there's something in broader life about that. Most people I come across are very well intentioned. We may not agree about the way something should be done or even what should we do, but I don't question my colleagues' intentions ever, really, because I think people are in organisations like the BBC for good reasons, and their intentions are very, very honourable. And there's something about the marathon runner in that. Everybody's trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to get to the same destination. They may have completely different methods of doing it. They may go fast, they may go slow, they may have some weird techniques, they may be dressed as a pepper army, but they're all trying to achieve the same thing. And I do see parallels with that.
You mentioned that shared energy, that camaraderie when a group of people come together for a mass participation event like running. And I know you'll appreciate this. It's an amazing feeling when you get that sense of togetherness. Do you see parallels in your work and in leadership and kind of how you bring teams together in that same way?
Yes, I think so. I wonder whether those parallels are even stronger if you're into team sport, which, as I said earlier, I'm not really. Because there is something slightly lonely about, there's a book, isn't there, called The Loneliness of a Long Distance Runner. So I think there's a resilience point about that, which does stand you in very good stead. And I love company. I didn't get into running because I'm a solitary type of person. The opposite. I love going to the pub with friends or meeting up with loads of family or spending time with folks that I'm fond of, whether they're family or not. And so it's not a loneliness that I take into broader life. But I think your point about the lessons you learn in one walk of life being applicable to another absolutely applies. I think one of them is patience. I'm not a sprinter, I'm a distance runner. And I think you learn, therefore, that you just got, there's a grind about that. And there are tough times when you've got to grit your teeth and get through the wall, the barrier, whatever phrase you use. And I also think there's something in the lesson that, you didn't win a medal for doing everything without any help or assistance. So if you need an energy gel, take it. And the same is true in work. If someone's offering to help you do something, accept that graciously. And I think that does help you get to the finish line in both senses of that word.
You mentioned a moment ago about having, with the people that you work with, you never question their intention and always see the good in people. Are you an optimist when it comes to life? And do you always try and look at things positively?
I try. Whether I always succeed or not, I don't know. It's a good thing, I think, to try to be optimistic, although not unreasonably so. But I think you can also, as a runner, you can start off thinking, oh, the weather's really terrible today for a run. It's really too hot. Or it's absolutely brutally cold and very strong wind or whatever it might be. And actually, I think starting off feeling that you're determined to get through it is probably a better phrase than optimism necessarily for that. But that helps. I think optimism can also lead you to some degree of disappointment when you're running. I remember one year that my family always go to the same point at the marathon to watch and cheer. And it's at about 23 miles. And I've always found them, and I've always thought it's a really uplifting thing as you're coming into that last really tough 3 miles. And then one year, my wife couldn't make it. She'd been there every single year, but she couldn't make it because my son was playing a football tournament and needed to be driven to, I can't remember where, but somewhere. And so my brother came down, and that was great. And he brought my daughter down. But he had this idea that he would get a better view and it would be better for me if he was on the other side of the road. Well, as anyone who's run the London Marathon knows, that's just not a good plan, because if you're looking to the right and the people you're looking for on the left, you're never going to hear them. And I remember running past there, and that was a massively deflationary feeling because I'd built up optimism about that point when I would see the family, and I really expected him to be there. And that was a very tough 3 miles, that last 3 miles. And we laughed and joked about it afterwards. But it comes back to what I was saying before. People act with good intent, and his intent was absolutely perfect. He thought he was doing the right thing. And that's always worth bearing in mind, I think, when optimism turns out to be a little bit ill-founded, which can happen from time to time.
Switching to your work, are there any highlights in all those events that I mentioned in the intro, all those things that you covered, things that you're proud to have been there at a particular moment? And I did want to mention, as a sports fan, was the Olympics quite special as well?
Yeah, I've done two Olympics in a kind of hands-on way. I went to Beijing in 2008 and did sort of ran the operation there for ITN. And the reason that was such a big story is because obviously we knew by then that the UK would have the Olympics 4 years later. So it's a massive story, and I absolutely loved it. And I think all of that stuff is so inspiring. And what's great about the Olympics, I mean, I love the athletic side of things, but you'd expect me to say that as a runner. But what is so great is just going to see sports that you don't know anything about. So a friend and I managed to get tickets to the rowing in Beijing one afternoon, and I'd never been to a rowing event before, and I haven't been to one since. But it was one where Britain won a gold. It was absolutely brilliant. The velodrome, I don't know. My brother's a mad cyclist, but he's a road cyclist. And I've not really ever done velodromes before, but that was really interesting. And then in London in 2012, in some ways, actually, professionally speaking, it was a slightly frustrating experience because when you're covering sport for television, you are really restricted by the contractual rights you have to the pictures and the presence in the arenas and so on. And the BBC owns the rights to the Olympics. So working at ITN at the time, we were outsiders on a temporary newsroom built in a porter cabin on the roof of the John Lewis car park. So it wasn't particularly glamorous. But I loved the Olympics being in London. I thought it was such an upbeat and positive thing. It was inspiring. We got some tickets to go and see the gymnastics. Again, I'd never really been to a gymnastics thing before. And I guess that's a bit like running, isn't it? You're competing for yourself. You're competing against yourself. I always think that one of the tricks about solo sports is you're competing against yourself. You're competing against the mind games or the physical exhaustion or the target that you set yourself. And you're doing it hopefully in a way that's rewarding and brings you satisfaction, and that's not necessarily winning anything. But if you're winning against yourself, that's a real trick, I think.
You mentioned the London Marathon and some of the marathons you've done. Are there any runs, whether maybe it is a London Marathon, but are there any other runs that stick out in your mind as special moments in time, stuff that you remember and you will just carry forward to the end of your days?
Yeah, I mean, most of my memories are around the London Marathon because I've done 10 of those, but I haven't done any other marathon. Every one I've done has always been London. And I've had friends who've said, "Oh, you should go to New York," and maybe I should, but I always think if I go to New York, I've got loads of things to do there, and I don't particularly want to spend the time having a sort of jet-lagged, alcohol-free few days preparing for a grueling run.
Yeah.
I'd rather do that at home, to be honest. There are lots of memories, and most of them are lovely moments in London where you are running with alongside some people who are doing some amazing things. The wheelchair athletes are always incredibly inspiring. And again, for those who've done the course, you turn right off Tower Bridge along Broadway, and on the other side of the same road, on the dual carriageway, when I'm going outbound, the wheelchair elites are coming in. And that's unbelievably inspiring, I think. It really is. And then you do the great loop around Isle of Dogs, which is not the nicest bit of the race, to be honest. And when I come back in, the people going outbound then are the fun runners. And they're the people they're probably doing their first marathon. They're running for a really good cause. They very often are wearing a shirt that says, they're running for their partner or their mum or dad or even one of their kids who's died very sadly, and they're raising money. Oh, that's incredibly inspiring stuff. I think that's a really powerful thing about the marathon because it's where a sporting event, an elite sporting event, one of the great sporting events in the world, meets the real lives of literally tens of thousands of people doing it for a whole host of reasons. That's an incredibly moving experience, I think. And I certainly found the first couple of marathons really quite emotional from that point of view. And even now, I find that quite a big thing, actually, in the motivation for getting round.
There's something, isn't there, about towards the end of those longer distances where the emotions just come, can come flooding forward, and you find places in your mind, in your life that maybe you didn't realise were there. It does open you up to thinking in certain ways, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. Because by the time, to be honest, by the time you get round, you're in the last 5 or 6 miles, you haven't got anything else to go on. You've run out of energy.
Yeah.
You've had too many gels, and your teeth feel like they're rotting to the core because you've consumed so much sugar.
Yeah.
I always think one of the great tips I picked up actually from the marathon was in your hand luggage that you pile on the lorries, always take a toothbrush and a toothpaste to scrub away the gels because it's such a horrible feeling. But yeah, of course, it's the emotion. Sometimes you can be motivated by just a determination to overcome the odds. So I remember one year I had an IT band that was pretty sore, and I was desperate to get one of those good aggressive rubs from one of those wonderful St John's people who sit on the side of the course. And
Yeah.
I came across one of those. There was a St John's flag. I thought, oh, thank goodness for that. I'm going to get a bit of relief on this. I was just coming off the back of Canary Wharf, and some poor bloke in front of me more or less collapsed, and I thought, well, I can't possibly distract the St John's, so I ran on a bit further, and I just kept running and got through it. And the second or third year, I think, I'd never really suffered from. Are we allowed to talk about jogger's nipple? I think we are, aren't we, on a runner's podcast?
We can, yeah.
Yeah. And I was inevitably wearing a white shirt, and I had these red streaks coming down both sides of my chest, and God, they were sore. But actually, the motivation of finishing the run, because there was no other way of getting the shirt off, proved to be quite powerful.
You've talked about how inspiring that London Marathon experience can be, and how the different inspirations that you can see there. In terms of leadership, who inspires you in leadership? Where do you get your energy from in that space?
Oh, that's a great question, and probably in truth not in the running world. I've been lucky enough to work for some fantastic editors and journalists over the years, and some who've really inspired me and whose lessons I've taken into my career. And I'm in touch with many of them, and it's great. Many of them have retired now, and I walk in their shadow in many ways. And none of them really have come to me through running. They've come to me through work experience. Many of them have been extremely generous, by the way. Whenever I've done the marathon, I always try and turn it to a good cause. So I tend to raise money for the Red Cross, and there's a real camaraderie and support for that, and very often from people who've been great leaders for me. And one reason for that is that there's a thing we call the journalist paradox, and the journalist paradox is that when most people are trying to leave somewhere in the world, we're trying to go there. It might be a war zone or an earthquake zone, or there's been a revolution somewhere or whatever, and we're swimming against the tide, and we're going into places that other people are trying to quit. And people at the Red Cross are usually there too. And so with journalists, I often say to them, I do the Red Cross because they have their own version of the journalist paradox, and that's been quite motivating for me, and also spurred a lot of leaders that I've been lucky enough to work with to be extremely generous, both to me personally, but also financially to that charity. And I think using the opportunity to do something good in life, like raising a few £1,000s for some good causes, is just an added value to doing events like London. I'd always urge people to do that. Of course, you can go in the ballot and get a place if you are lucky. Odds are quite slim, but it's not impossible. But why wouldn't you just try to do something good out of it and improve someone's life somewhere? That's a really, from my point of view at least, a really positive way of converting your energy and your time into something great for someone else.
Here, absolutely. We talked about the mental health benefits of running and the energy that you get when the extra energy that you get when you go out running. I mean, in the space that you work in, the people that you work with, it must be pretty tough, and to be having to be exposed to all those things that are going on in the world and report on those and deal with those. Is running ever something that you'd recommend to colleagues as a mechanism for coping, or as an outlet for some of the stuff that they might be dealing with at work?
I'd always recommend to colleagues they have something. I don't think it has to be running, although, of course, I personally find running is the right thing for me. But, I've got colleagues who are in a choir or play football or whatever. I don't think it actually much matters what it is. It slightly depends on your personality and what you're good at. There's no point pursuing something you're hopeless at. That's just frustrating, right? So I think the key to it, to be honest, is twofold. There are two keys to it. The first is to have something that you really want to do in your spare time. Because if it's a drag, frankly, you're going to find excuses not to. So you've got to find something that you want to do. And with running, that isn't necessarily obvious on day one. You might need to give it a while. The second is that even in a busy and dynamic walk of life, like journalism, and I use the word dynamic because right now sitting here talking to you, there is no major breaking story happening, but in 10 minutes' time that might be different. So your life is not entirely controllable, but you have to have some grip on your priorities. And so for example, I run in an athletics club every Tuesday evening with a group of people who've become friends and comrades on the streets. And I really prioritise that time. That doesn't mean that I every single week make it, but it does mean that I start the week intending to make it, and 9 times out of 10 I do. And that's been quite a release. And actually started during lockdown because I was working from home a lot more, and it was a lot easier to organise. And I've sort of taken that back into an office world, which is most of my time now is back in the office. And I found that discipline of I've got to leave at this time on a Tuesday because actually this is really important to me. So the bar for disrupting that is high. That doesn't mean to say that if there's some really, really big issue came up, I wouldn't have to prioritise that. But it's really important to me to get out to do the running club. So the bar's got to be really high to disrupt it.
That idea of prioritising time and having the intention is so important, isn't it, in life, to protect the things that's important to you?
It is, and you build up that resilience as well. And you build up techniques for saying to people, look, I know you want to see me, but I just can't see you then. And the reason isn't because I've got a more important work commitment. It's because I've got something I do outside work which helps me and which I enjoy. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's obviously there's a balance here. Mine is just once a week. I think that's a reasonable trade-off, and the rest of the time I'm pretty available. But as I mentioned, I don't take my phone even when I'm running, so I'm just not available. And the thing about this, I'm sure this applies in most walks of life. It certainly applies in my walk of life. No one is indispensable. If colleagues can't reach you to make a decision that they think you should make, someone else will make it. And it's just like when you're on an aeroplane. So I dread the days when I get onto a plane and someone says Wi-Fi is available. I don't want Wi-Fi. I want to sit on a plane and have a few hours off, thanks. And that's the same with going for a run. I want to be uncontactable, and that's not because I'm an isolationist. It's because it's a mental thing about having some time to focus on something else.
And does that mean music podcasts aren't part of your running experience as well?
They're not. They were when I first started. First 2 or 3 years, I had a little iPod, which were then very fashionable, and I loaded on 200 songs or something that were a combination of things I liked or things with a rhythm that I could run to. And there's still things that I like, but on the I think it might have been the second or third marathon, I hit a bit of a wall. I thought I'll put my headphones in. It was such a mistake. Because even just putting my headphones in disrupted my rhythm. And then it's so noisy on the streets that I could hardly hear the music anyway. And I got frustrated about that because actually I thought if I could just hear, I can't remember what music it was now, but if I could just hear that, it would help me through the next mile. In the end, I just took the headphones out and I've never used them again, even for training runs. I just go and I live in a lovely part of the countryside. I'm very, very lucky, got nice country lanes around us, and so we've got the sounds of nature and fresh air, and I never ever take music, and I haven't done for 7 or 8 years at least.
There's something so powerful about running in nature as well. I mean, we've talked about it on previous podcasts where just being out there in the green, in the blue, it can be so energizing, can't it?
It's like, we're talking in March and the daffodils are out, and I always think one of the nice things about London being timed for April is that you do your really long runs about this time of year. I'm not doing it this year, so I'm not involved in that. But each week you see a bit more of life coming back into nature. You see a few more flowers out or a bit more greenery on the bushes. Can be quite cold and brutal, of course, this time of year, but just monitoring that as you go through. And I've got a regular route that I do pretty often, which is about an 8 miler from home, just a quick circuit that I do most weeks. And every week something's changed. And that's just a really lovely way of marking time in a good way.
Have you seen your goals change over the years, both from a work perspective and in running?
Yeah, I think from a running perspective, first of all, the goals about the marathon were very largely in the first few years about time. Can I get around in 4? Can I get around in 3:50? Whatever. I don't really hold that particularly close anymore because I feel I'm not going to go any faster now. You know, you just inevitably get a bit slower as you get older, not radically so, but a bit. And so, you know, if I do go around again and I haven't decided whether to or not, it would be much more about enjoying it, making the most of the experience, soaking it all in, getting around in one piece, that sort of thing. It's slightly less ambitious in some ways, but maybe a little bit more enjoyable. And in work, certainly not less ambitious. You know, the job requires ambition to deliver. So I wouldn't say that's changed, but what constitutes success changes over the years because you become more rounded in your judgments about things, hopefully, and whether you succeed in that or not is, you know, other people can judge, but you become perhaps less fixated on an individual task and more on the overall outcome that you're trying to achieve. And I spend a lot of time saying to colleagues, look, this isn't about achieving a certain task. It's about the outcome at the end of the day. And that's a bit like running. You know, the task might be to get in 4 hours, but the outcome is to finish the race. So outcome is more important than task, certainly for me, as I've got older and more experienced.
I've got to ask, does anything surprise you anymore? Because it feels like the world that we're in at the moment and events that have happened over the years, you could not make some of the stuff up. As a journalist, as an observer of world events, do you still get surprised when things take a twist and go in a different direction?
Yes, and I think when you stop being surprised, it's probably the time to stop being a journalist because there's never been a perfect definition of news, but one attempt at a definition that I like is that news is the unexpected. And if you think about that, that doesn't mean to say that you can't make a news story out of something you're expecting to happen, but it's always going to be a better story if something unexpected happens along the way. And so you should always be surprised about things, surprised as opposed to shocked. I think if you look back at what we've been dealing with, particularly around the pandemic, the individual incremental move of, you know, a Tuesday had a different storyline from a Monday, which was different from the Sunday. They weren't in themselves surprises because it moved, at times anyway, over a 2.5 year period. It moved quite slowly. But the surprise looking back at it is immense. You know, what we went through as a population, what did and didn't work, the deaths of so many. These are all things that you should be surprised about and most importantly curious about as a journalist. And I think if you get out of bed in the morning and you don't have a mission to explain the surprises and to, you know, to rationalize them and just sometimes to be just a bit gobsmacked, then you know you've probably lost the burning candle in your career at that stage, and maybe that'll happen. It hasn't happened yet, touch wood. So you know, watch this space.
At the moment, is it tough to do what you do? You know, when you look back at people that have been in your role over the years, do you think that this is a hard time to be doing this job?
I suspect there's never really been an easy time to do this job, and that's not a complaint, by the way. I think the jobs that we do are challenging. That's the way it should be. We're paid public money to do difficult things, and that's fine. I think this particular era, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, etc., is tricky. There are lots of challenges, and being in the BBC is challenging because the way we approach some of those stories becomes quite controversial and quite time consuming to deal with, and you can be in a bit of a no-win thing. and that's when rationalising things over an 8 mile run is very helpful. But I imagine if whoever was sitting in my seat during, I don't know, the Falklands War or the 1970s industrial crises or disasters we've known and loved. I remember when I was at ITN, there was a series of disasters of one sort or another around. The Herald of Free Enterprise sank just before I joined ITN, actually, but then there was the King's Cross fire, the Enniskillen bomb, the Kegworth air crash, Lockerbie. They all happened within a fairly short period of time. And you talked about surprise earlier, and if you've got to have an element of inhumanity if you're not surprised by those sorts of stories. And they're immensely challenging things. It's equally, but in a different way, immensely challenging to cover or be involved in the management of coverage of a war in Europe that's gone on for more than a year, or a really controversial issue like Brexit, where your audience take very polarising views, and some portions of those audience choose to make that a dispute between themselves and the BBC because they don't recognise their views being portrayed in a way that they think is fair. And everyone's entitled to their view. They all pay for us. But that is a stressful and difficult combination of things. But my predecessors will have had equivalent stresses and strains, and that's the nature of the beast. And frankly, we wouldn't really have it any other way, because it's what makes it's the intersection between what we do and the audience who consume it. And if you don't have that, then you're broadcasting into a vacuum, which is a totally pointless exercise. So all of that is said in the spirit of, yeah, it can be tough, and you have to have coping mechanisms, and we've talked about how running is part of that, but none of that is a complaint at all.
Jonathon, a couple of questions to finish.
Sure.
Running aside, can you name a business tool, an app, a person, something that you couldn't do without in your work world?
Oh, I think that you mentioned a person. I'm not going to say it's an individual, although I've got a couple of close colleagues in mind who are sounding boards and confidants about loads of stuff. And I think that comes down to an absolute relationship of trust, that you can share something, even kind of outlandish thoughts, what if we scrapped this, reinvented that, whatever. Just having someone to think aloud to, who is going to trust the confidence of that intimacy, has always been crucial for me. And there have been many people like that over the years, and none of them have let me down. And I think having trust in your colleagues is really important. And some you will decide, are not the right partner for you in that kind of relationship. But if you can find one or two people in your working life, you might not agree with them about everything. You might strongly disagree with them about some things. That's probably quite healthy. But you can share stuff with them, and you really respect what they think about your perceptions. That you can't put a price on that.
That's great advice. Business aside, what's your favourite bit of running kit or a running accessory you can't do without?
I'm a fairly simple runner, really. Because as I said earlier, I don't run with music. I've got drawerfuls of kit acquired from every marathon and qualifying race, and I've got sweatshirts and goodness knows what else. I think the thing that, apart from having very good running shoes, that's a very important point. You'll have discussed this, I'm sure, on many podcasts, but I saw a Facebook post from someone I know the other day who's doing their first London Marathon, and they're in the tough stage of 18-mile training runs, and their knees are hurting badly, and they're going to change their trainers. And I'm thinking, blimey, that is really late in the day. But they never got themselves properly gait assessed. And I went to, I think this will be a common thing for lots of your audience. Go and get yourself assessed by professionals who can give you the best running shoes for your gait. It's so important, and changing them a few weeks before the marathon when you're about to do your last long run, that's not a great place to be, right? So get the right shoes is an obvious point. I use a brand called Brooks Adrenaline, which worked for me really well. Other brands are available, but getting that advice from people who look at, this guy said to me, I'm going to film your kneecaps, and I want your kneecaps to be going straight forward like the headlights on your car. And if they're not, I'm going to give you the trainers to adjust them. And he was the best advisor I've ever had. He was brilliant. The final thing I've never run with a sort of massive sort of bag of kit, but get some shorts that have got plenty of little zip-up pockets for your keys, your gels, your nipple plasters if you're a guy, because you need them.
Indeed.
And you sometimes look at shorts and think, oh, they're a really nice colour, or they're gonna go with that shirt really well. And you get them off the shelf and they've got no pockets, or they've got a tiny thing you can't even get a car key into, or whatever. Get some with zip-up pockets. Really simple stuff.
Great advice. I stopped trying to coordinate running gear many years ago. It's got to be the right stuff, hasn't it?
Definitely.
And the final question: what advice would you give to anybody listening to this who's in a business role, a leadership role, and they're considering getting more active, specifically taking up running? What would your advice be?
Well, first of all, do it. Secondly, don't expect to run a marathon on week one. Build up slowly. You've got to work out yourself whether you're a sprinter or a middle distance person or a long distance person. You're not going to know that until you give it a go. I've said in this conversation, personally, I don't use music. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't. Personally, I don't have loads of kit with me. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't. Do what's right for you. But most of all, I think, and it's give yourself a bit of time. Don't decide after run 1 or run 2, this isn't going to work for you. Give yourself 6 months. If you're going to give yourself 6 months, go and buy some decent running shoes. Don't do what I did and buy some tennis shoes that you thought were for running and weren't. Just make it, if it's 6 months of your life and you're going to work out at the end of it whether it's going to be part of your life or not, you're going to spend quite a few hours in those running shoes. Just invest a little bit in giving yourself the best chance of making it work for you. And then at least if it doesn't, you can say to yourself, I gave it a really good go. It's not for me. I'll go back to the chessboard or the choir or whatever. You've tried. There's nothing wrong with that.
Jonathon Munro, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for being so open and honest. It's been a fascinating conversation. And enjoy your next run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you.
Thanks again to Jonathon Munro for his time on Run the Business this week. Another fascinating conversation about running and leadership. And thanks to Jonathon for being so open and thoughtful about his role and responsibilities he has at the BBC as well. So much of what he was saying made me think about the mental health benefits of exercise and specifically running and how valuable they can be, especially if you're in a senior role or a leadership position where running becomes your space. I know we've talked about this before on the podcast, but as a journalist who is, I guess, always switched on, always has stuff going on, to have something like running with no phone, no music, as an outlet must be quite powerful to have that space you can go to. And I know that transfers to many other walks of life as well. I know one of the many benefits I get from running is my own space and time to ponder and contemplate life. But that dynamic new space that Jonathon talks about must be quite overpowering if you don't have something in your life to give you that counterbalance to it. It was interesting to hear him talk about the journalist's paradox as well, and also how running can be used to do something good in life, to raise some money for a good cause. Another huge benefit of mass participation running events. Having people around you that you trust was something else I took from that conversation. People that might disagree with you some of the time, maybe a lot of the time, but people that you can bounce ideas off, debate with, test things out with in a safe and confidential space. Long-term successful leadership can't be a solo event. I hear that so many times. And some great practical advice there as well if you're running, especially towards the end. If you're a new runner, you can run in any trainers if you're starting out. But if you're serious and the longer your distance, the more important it is to get a pair of running shoes that fit and the gait is right for you. Take that away from this conversation if you take nothing else. Run the Business is a Real 2 Media production. If you're not already doing so, please follow the podcast, download, comment, share. I would be super grateful if you could do that right now before you go off and do something else. And maybe you're off running. Enjoy that run if you're going out now, or maybe you are out there already. I'm Anthony Gay, and until next time, happy running and keep chasing your goals.